Good evening and welcome. My name is John Tessitore, and I have the privilege of being moderator to this distinguished panel this evening. Before beginning, I want to certainly thank Heather Campion and the staff of the ARCO Forum for the opportunity and privilege of being here with you tonight. We're looking forward to it. I have been asked to moderate by dint of being the Director of Communications of the United Nations Association of the USA. And just a brief word, we are a national membership organization devoted to strengthening the work of the UN and U.S. participation in the UN system. We have 176 chapters throughout the U.S., and we're very proud to have with us tonight several representatives of our 600-member strong Greater Boston chapter, and so we welcome all of you along with the Harvard community. Now, my role is a simple one. I am the keeper of the clock, and I have it right here. And it's a role that I shall treat seriously. But let me introduce you to the important people at this table. Our three panelists come from different countries and diverse backgrounds, yet they share the common denominator of possessing sharp minds and articulating uncommonly clear thinking. Consequently, their ideas and opinions are frequently sought both by the media and the international affairs community on a variety of issues. I shall introduce them in alphabetical order, beginning with Alvaro de Soto. Alvaro de Soto is the senior political advisor to Mr. Boutros Boutros-Ghali, Secretary General of the United Nations, a position to which he was appointed in February 1992. He holds the rank of Assistant Secretary General. Mr. de Soto has been a member of the Secretary General's Executive Office since he joined the United Nations as Special Assistant to Secretary General Javier Perez de Cuellar in 1982. He is on special leave from the Peruvian Diplomatic Service, in which he holds the rank of Career Ambassador. In addition to his responsibilities as the Secretary General's Senior Political Advisor and his duties as a member of the Secretary General's Task Force on UN peace-related operations, Mr. de Soto oversees the Office of the Secretary General's spokesman and covers human rights and humanitarian assistance questions. I think I will introduce all three gentlemen, and then we will begin with remarks. Our second speaker is someone whom I'm sure the Harvard community knows very, very well. Stanley Hoffman is Douglas Dillon Professor of the Civilization of France at Harvard University, where he has taught since 1955. He has been the chairman of the Center for European Studies at Harvard since its creation in 1969. Born in Vienna, Professor Hoffman teaches French intellectual and political history, American foreign policy, the sociology of war, international politics, ethics and world affairs, modern political ideologies, and development of the modern state. His books are far too many to mention, but I will mention that he is currently working with Professor Michael Smith of the University of Virginia on a book on ethics in international relations. And his Tanner Lectures of 1993 on the French nation and nationalism will be published soon. Our third guest is Edward C. Locke, and he is president of the United Nations Association of the USA, based in New York City. In addition to his duties as president of a national organization, Ed Locke is a frequent media commentator and has published and testified widely on arms control, national security policy, Soviet foreign policy, now Russian, the United Nations, and multilateral diplomacy. He has edited 2 books and published, actually not even scores, I think it's fair to say hundreds of articles and op-eds in major journals. And of course, as my president, I can testify to the kind of work that he is doing in this field. And so what I'm now going to ask is each of these gentlemen to speak for 8 minutes. I will give you a 1-minute warning, and then we will open it up to questions. That's what you've all come for. Mr. de Soto, if you would begin.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here and very pleased. As a professional diplomat, I would first like to make the comment that becoming involved in the crisis and conflict in the former Yugoslavia is not a diplomat's dream. Quite the contrary. The according to the rule of thumb that one should not dive into an empty pool, the former Yugoslavia meets the definition of an empty pool. And it is not something that the United Nations or the diplomats who headed it then and head it now would have chosen to do. It is said that they entered the fray, the diplomatic fray, against their better judgment. This may be the case, may not be the case. It is, in part, a conflict which is characteristic of the age in which we live. Following the end of the Cold War, the world situation seems to have become far worse and far more dangerous than it was before. And the very concept of the state seems to be called into question. And this in many parts of the world, the former Yugoslavia being one of them. The United Nations took on the former Yugoslavia as a peacekeeping operation in early 1992 in a division of labor with the then European Community, where the European Community was in charge of the diplomacy. The relationship and the division of labor was not a comfortable one, and it had to be adjusted fairly quickly toward the middle of 1992, when we found ourselves in the rather odd position of being a kind of a subcontractor to the European Community and to the projects that it cooked up in terms of peacekeeping for the United Nations. Our mandate in the former Yugoslavia has since grown, and unfortunately it has not grown in the sense of neat, architecturally designed multidisciplinary operations such as the one that we had in Namibia or in Cambodia, or that we still have in El Salvador. Quite the contrary, the mandate grew by accretion. And we have a situation where the United Nations is, in conjunction with the European Union, supposed to be in charge of the diplomatic effort, the long-term effort at establishing a negotiated solution to all of the conflicts in the former Yugoslavia. At the same time, the United Nations is trying to keep the peace between interposed between separated combatants in Croatia. It is also trying to do that gradually in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And we have also established in an experiment practically, a peacekeeping operation in Macedonia where no conflict had occurred yet, but in terms of a preventive deployment, first time that this has ever been tried. Furthermore, the United Nations, through the High Commissioner for Refugees, in an activity that is beyond its normal mandate, but that it is conducting at the request of the Secretary General, is carrying out a massive humanitarian assistance program, which probably has saved hundreds of thousands of lives, including, among other things, the very difficult and frequently suspended operation of delivery from Frankfurt mostly to Sarajevo Airport. At the same time, the United Nations, more recently, has found itself in the rather uncomfortable position of having to protect the delivery of humanitarian assistance by escorting convoys organized by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in order to deliver humanitarian assistance in conditions that are extremely difficult and that bring us sometimes in confrontation with some of the parties whose cooperation we need in order to be able to keep the peace, and certainly in order to be able to negotiate a solution to the conflict. The relationship between these different mandates that have been given to us by the Security Council is an uncomfortable one because of the competing logics behind each of them, which has created what, to use a word in vogue, at least in the psychoanalytical field, makes for a dysfunctional relationship as between the different mandates that we have. It is not a happily integrated, cozy relationship. It requires constant adjustment, and it puts us in a position where we have frequently to establish priorities or keep some of these activities in abeyance when certain crises arise. For instance, over the confrontation regarding Gorazde, we were obliged to suspend the delivery of humanitarian assistance. At difficult moments, the continuation of the diplomatic efforts is called into question. The goal is and must be, notwithstanding the naysayers, a negotiated solution to not only the problems in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also in the entire former Yugoslavia, because it is very difficult to separate them, though presumably by now we can separate out the problems of Slovenia. But everything else is interlocked because of the overlapping ethnic and other groups and the fact that that is inevitable, unavoidable, that we will have to reconcile all of those interests. Now, it is very difficult to lose, it's very easy, I mean, to lose sight of the goal of an overall comprehensive settlement to the problems of the territories of the former Yugoslavia. But we have tried, nonetheless, to keep above the fray and do that. What we have now is a situation where the Secretary General's special representative on the ground, who is Mr. Yasushi Akashi, who's based in Zagreb, but who's responsible for all activities in the field and for ensuring the coordination of all of these different mandates, is in a position separate from, but in tight coordination with, the persons who are in charge of conducting the diplomatic effort, these being the co-chairman of the steering committee of the International Conference on the former Yugoslavia, Thorvald Stoltenberg of Norway on behalf of the United Nations, and Lord Owen on behalf of the European Union. You might not have that impression reading the papers, but actually the situation that has been created as a result of the avoided confrontation between NATO acting on behalf of the United Nations and the Serbs in Gorazde, with the establishment of a stable though tense situation in Sarajevo, with the growing practice regarding the safe areas, may actually now offer an opportunity for reflecting on what it is possible to do in terms of a comprehensive settlement, without which it will not be possible, I repeat, to reach any settlement. The only possibility of solving these different conflicts is ultimately by getting all the parties together with the countries that are most directly involved in or interested in the solution to the problem, and to discuss between them what a final outcome might look like. I happen to think, this is a very personal view, and I don't believe that I'm too far from reality, that one of the problems that we have had throughout this agonizing process has been that the parties have not had a chance to actually look at the overall picture and have a peek at what the final outcome might be. In other words, that some of the parties that are deemed to be more recalcitrant than others have not had a chance to see what is in it for them in ending the military pressure. And this, at this stage, we may very well be entering a phase where all of the parties are actually, with the relative stability, comparative stability that now exists, though there are still ominous signs, and there will again be low moments and bad moments, and there will be more atrocities. At this moment, the different parties are each separately starting to reflect on what the final outcome might look like. So the time may just be right. And I'll stop at that point. Thank you.
Professor Hoffman.
Well, I'm a great admirer of Mr. De Soto, and nothing that I'm going to say should be taken as a criticism of the UN as an organization, because the UN essentially does what its members tell it to do. And when its members engage in an extraordinary combination of schizophrenia, impotence, and ostrich-like behavior, it is not entirely surprising that the United Nations should have its trouble. I will tell you honestly that I look at the conflict as somebody who grew up in the 1930s and to whom much of what has been going on in Yugoslavia reminds much too much of some of the things that I thought we would not see again after the defeat of Nazism. To me, the central issue is ethnic cleansing, the destruction of a multi-ethnic community by force, with the rest of the world engaging in an exercise of Byzantine complexity worthy of UNESCO's rhinoceros. And here I would like to underline something that Mr. De Soto said. He said it with all the elegance of a diplomat. Let me say it with the freedom a Harvard professor enjoys. There are, in fact, 3 different operations going on, and each one shoots the other 2 in the foot. And the so-called world community falls very nicely between 3 stools, and while it's sitting there, people die. At the same time, there is a negotiation in which one pretends that the parties are equal, morally. Secondly, there's a humanitarian operation aimed at helping the victims. And thirdly, there is a set of measures which, implicitly at least, treat one of the parties as an aggressor. You cannot do all 3 things at the same time. The fact that one negotiates as if the aggressors and their victims were the same, so to speak, inhibits any tendency to use force effectively. And for months and months, we've heard the various negotiators, Lord Carrington, Lord Owen, Mr. Vance, etc., tell us that the last thing one should do in order to get those negotiations to succeed is ever threaten the use of force. The very fact that there is this extensive humanitarian intervention has become a splendid alibi for not using force, since essentially the humanitarian forces are hostages, and the Serbs know exactly when to tighten the screws on them. And in fact, the presence of those forces, which are entirely dependent or largely dependent on Serb goodwill, consolidates the Serb position in the negotiations, just as the arms embargo, which hits the Bosnians far more than the Serbs, helps the Serbs. So we are dealing with three things at the same time. The one precedent for this is the way the League of Nations handled the Italian aggression in Ethiopia, in which one negotiated, and at every stage of the negotiation one made bigger concessions to Mussolini, and the sanctions were kept limited so as not to hamper the negotiations. At the end, Mussolini got all. It seems to me that it is a little late now, but there are still things which are left to save, such as what remains of Bosnia, all the parts which have not yet been gobbled up, and particularly the so-called safe havens. And if in a perfectly Cartesian world, which this is not, what I would have argued for is that one give absolute priority to the issue of first stopping the use of force. And at this point, the use of force is an aggressive use of force by one party, which has very clear objectives, which nobody can pretend it doesn't know. And it's only after that use of force and the resort to methods which, if they do not constitute genocide, let not argue about definitions, certainly constitute crimes against humanity under the Nuremberg definition, after that has stopped, then one can negotiate. And if one wants a fair settlement, it cannot be done while the aggression goes on, and it cannot be done unless there is very strong pressure from the major powers in trying to obtain some sort of a rollback of the Serbs. But at this point, if I was a Serbian leader with a design for a grand or larger Serbia, I would really be delighted at the way in which I will made fools of the international community with its slightly cowardly complicity. I repeat, this is not the problem of the UN. The UN has a very serious problem, even with the limited forces, very limited indeed, that the countries have put at its disposal. One sometimes wonders whether the commanders of those forces reflect the will of the organization or the political preferences of the countries from which they come. And if they come from England and from France, they haven't exactly been entirely objective at times. So it seems to me that if one wants to get a repeat to a settlement now, the first thing to do is to prevent this extraordinary game in which the Serbs threaten one city. So after a large amount of pressure and excitement, one gets them not to lift the siege, but just to remove their guns a little bit. Then they move to the next city, and this can go on forever as a sort of shell game. But I think the lessons for the future, insofar as there will be future such cases, the first lesson for the future is that one should not engage in operations which, as Mr. De Soto said, are inherently contradictory, that the first thing to obtain is a cessation to the use of force, and that it is absolutely imperative, as the Secretary General himself suggested 2 years ago, that the United Nations try to get from its members a new sort of force, which is not the old peacekeeper, which presupposes that an agreement has already been reached, which is not the sort of collective security operation a la Gulf War, but which is something which could be called peace enforcing in areas like those safe havens. This is something I understand that is now being discussed for the other and even more colossal horror of Rwanda. But this is really what is needed in a world in which otherwise the only triumph will be that of ethnic cleansing and the massacre of the innocents.
Thank you, Dr. Hoffman. We'll conclude with Ed Locke, please.
Sometimes the hardest acts to follow are the briefest. But I would just point out, when Ervo was discussing a little bit about the history, that the Security Council has now passed the century mark on this crisis. A century mark in terms of now having passed more than 100 resolutions and statements by the President of the Council. Each one seems to be more urgent than the one before, and in some cases each seems to be less credible or more incredible than the one before. As both of my fellow panelists have pointed out, this disease begins with the member states. And I think we have to look at the very first assumptions. As Elvero pointed out, this was initially to be a peacekeeping operation. Now, how you can impose a peacekeeping operation in the middle of an ongoing conflict, I really don't understand. There never was any peace to be kept. It was a question of trying to apply incentives and disincentives to the parties to press them to the negotiating table or to press them to take different positions once they were there. But the word schizophrenia, I think Professor Hoffman has used. My wife, the psychologist, tells me never to use that because it abuses an important psychiatric term, to use it in political science, but nevertheless, I think it's fairly descriptive. In the midst of these 100 resolutions, most taken under Chapter 6 as Pacific settlement, as traditional peacekeeping, were a few undertaken under Chapter 7, calling for and requiring enforcement by the member states. People forget that the first resolutions on the delivery of humanitarian assistance were taken under Chapter 7. All necessary means were to be used by the member states to ensure the delivery of that humanitarian assistance. Of course, with the very first blockages by one party or another, the peacekeepers who were there under a somewhat different mandate and under different marching orders felt that in fact they had to negotiate with the parties. They had to back down a number of times. Obviously, they shared a lot of the humanitarian assistance with one armed group or another there, in some cases even helping to fund the military operations through the diversion of humanitarian assistance. Now, I don't say that's the fault of the UN per se, but it was caught in this very unholy limbo by the kind of mandate that the member states gave it, completely inappropriate to the task. Then the no-fly zone again was Chapter 7, and for the longest period it was not enforced. It's only recently that it has been enforced effectively. And then, of course, the most infamous was the resolution a year ago on the 6 so-called safe havens. Now, the wording on these resolutions, on the Chapter 7, in fact, was in some cases a little stronger than the wording used to authorize Desert Storm. But if you compare the reaction of the member states, the amount of military power and sacrifices they're willing to commit, obviously there's no comparison whatsoever. And so very early on, it seems to me, the credibility of the international community was called into play, and the UN became of great service to the member states, not only for the rather brave and courageous and important humanitarian assistance that was delivered, but by providing a service as being a scapegoat. In fact, the Secretary General in recent months has come to saying that it's an important service for the UN to provide to the international community, in fact, for him to be the lightning rod for criticism, for member states to have someone to blame, whether it's for a unilateral raid conducted in Mogadishu by the Rangers, or whether it's the problems in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And I think there's some things that are worth thinking about for the future. One is the theory of preventive diplomacy that the Secretary General put forward very eloquently in his agenda for peace 2 years ago, assumed, I think correctly, that if you act early, as this preventive effort in Macedonia, you have a chance of heading off a crisis, perhaps with relatively little loss of life and relatively less risk. But if you wait years into the crisis, if you've already blown your credibility along the way, if you've passed 100 resolutions that no one pays attention to, and then all of a sudden you decide you're going to get tough, you should not wonder why people aren't taking you seriously, why in fact your words don't necessarily get the result that they want. And in fact the peacekeepers themselves are very much the target of violence these days, and in fact have the combination, as Professor Hoffman pointed out, that truly is schizophrenic, of on the one hand saying we're going to have a Chapter 7 operation from the air while we have Chapter 6 people on the ground, clearly does not make any sense from military terms or anything else. I think we see a process within our own country and in other countries as well, that you get in one hand an ambivalent and uncertain leadership that's looking at domestic issues. Second of all, you get a bureaucratic compromise where an airstrike is so tiny and ineffective, it's just enough to irritate people. and it's just enough to show how unserious you are about the military side of it. And of course, military activity, as Desert Storm suggested, is not something where ambivalence or bureaucratic compromise is especially helpful, any more than diplomatic compromise on a lot of resolutions tends to be. And I think for Americans, one of the things we have to think about is, what do we want out of the former Yugoslavia? I mean, are we seeking peace? If so, peace at any cost? Are we seeking justice, whatever that means anymore in that country? Are we simply hoping that it'll go away for a while so we can focus on our domestic priorities? I get the impression from people in Washington they sort of hope it would go away for a while so that we don't have to make hard, tough decisions. But once we decide what it is we want, I think we do then have to decide what sacrifices we're willing to undertake to make a difference. I think for a new administration to come in, and for one of the first things that it says in this crisis is that it would not under any conditions put troops on the ground as long as the fighting continues, that is a very clear sign of a lack of will. To think that you can do it from the air, that there's a technical solution, is militarily absurd and politically delivers completely the wrong message. So it does seem to me that yes, the question is negotiations. Sooner or later there does have to be a negotiated settlement. But I think the question is on what terms, on what basis, and in the end for what purpose. There have been times when there has been a successful peacekeeping in places like Cyprus, where the fundamental situation has never been resolved, and where the peacekeepers, yes, prevent violence, but at the same time they perhaps hinder a reintegration between the Greeks and the Turks on the island. And so now they've been there 30 years. Well, one has to think now about the next phase. If we were unwilling to commit any real national prestige, power, or blood to trying to alter the course of the conflict, what are we going to be willing to commit to hold any particular settlement in place? And what assurances do we have that the parties really will be, at some point in time in the near future, committed to a lasting settlement? Peacekeeping can work when there is cooperation of the parties, but when the parties do everything possible to undermine the mission, then it cannot be peacekeeping and it has to be enforcement or something else. And clearly we have shown we don't have the will for that. So I think more than anything else, I feel very sorry for those people on the ground, those people who are trying to slug this thing through and who have to watch day after day the indecision and the lack of will and the incoherence among the member states. Because clearly that is the bottom line. What are we willing to put up to achieve what kind of result? Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, all of you. Now we come to the open part of our forum, and we invite questions from any and all of you. What I'm going to ask is that if you have a question, that you go to either the microphone at my left or my right, and that you, one, identify yourself, two, as they say in Jeopardy, be sure your remarks are in the form of a question, and three, indicate to precisely whom you are addressing your question or if it's to the panel in general. And I'm going to take a liberty just to roll things out and ask one question and just for a brief answer from whomever. But I read in yesterday's Boston Globe that UN tanks fired 72 shells at Serb positions. I read also that the U.S. is intimating that a military invasion of Haiti is not absolutely out of the question. And I read just a week ago in the Christian Science Monitor that the commander of the Joint Chiefs said he supports U.S. participation in UN enforcement, even knowing full well that there would be the loss of U.S. life. Given all of that, I'm asking, is the U.S. administration and the international community coming to that public recognition that Freud made clear in his Civilization and Discontents many years ago, that unless there is a policeman on the corner, people will misbehave? Are we moving toward some kind of new recognition, new maturity that force can be and needs to be a role for good? Anyone at all?
All I can say is that the notion that force might be a recourse in order to impose peace is expressly provided for in the UN Charter.
Yeah.
if I might just comment, I think there should be, and the Charter suggested there ought to be, a division of labor. It's not the role of the Secretary General, Yasushi Akashi, or anyone from the Secretariat to get involved in decisions about bombings and the rest of it. That has been delegated to them by member states unwilling to make the decisions themselves. But there's nothing about the Secretary General or the Secretariat even mentioned in Chapter 7 on enforcement. It is said very clearly in the Charter there is to be a military staff committee, which has never been more than a luncheon club, made up of representatives of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the 5 permanent members, and it can have regional subcommittees, which could be useful in a crisis like this. And they should make the plans and make at least the contingency plans, maybe not oversee the forces, about how these things would be carried out. But to ask NATO, which was an alliance formed to counter the influence of one of the permanent members, to be the military wing of the Security Council to carry out its decisions, just shows what a paucity of infrastructure we have in the international community, whether it's in terms of economic sanctions or whether it's in terms of military sanctions. There is no structure under the Security Council to do these things. And what's going to happen in Korea? What's going to happen to other places where you don't even have a NATO? I think the whole thing is extremely chaotic, and maybe we will learn a lesson, maybe we'll come to our senses, as always, very, very late, and tens of thousands of casualties later.
I'm afraid that your information was yesterday. The last thing I heard coming over here was that the Pentagon remains absolutely opposed to any operation in which there might be American losses. This is the well-known new doctrine of American combatant immunity. And President Bush, who participated in the invasion of Grenada and invaded Panama, considers that one shouldn't do absolutely anything about Haiti. So I think we are still quite far from a consensus. And anyhow, what President Clinton says on Monday is usually contradicted by him or another member of the administration by Wednesday, so I'd rather wait.
Let's open it up, and why don't we start? We'll alternate from left to right, so please.
I'm Lubna Alaman, Mason Fellow here at the Kennedy School. And I have a question for Mr. De Soto and possibly Professor Hoffman or all the panel. While you mentioned the humanitarian intervention in Bosnia and that the ultimate goal is a negotiated solution, I'd like you to sort of draw a parallel with the humanitarian intervention in northern Iraq and whether there has been that sort of long-term goal. It seems that there has been no goal to reach a negotiated settlement whereby even peacekeeping forces could be there to see that an autonomous, let's say, region will be made for the Kurdish minority where the humanitarian assistance is provided for, and so that to have an integration, because as it seems today, I would like to know what the ultimate goal seems to be.
I'm not sure whether you can actually draw a parallel. I can't agree that what we have in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and indeed in the whole of the former Yugoslavia or large parts of it, is humanitarian intervention in the sense of the humanitarian intervention that's being carried out in northern Iraq, where it is carried out not entirely with the concurrence of the government concerned. In Bosnia, it is based on the consent of all the parties concerned, though once in a while one can place some doubt on that. In the case of the northern Iraq, however, it is carried out not at the express request and with the blessing of the Security Council, but as an interpretation of the decisions of the Security Council by certain member states, 3 member states to be exact.
Let's try and have as many questions as possible. This gentleman?
My question, actually, my name is Matt Anestis, and I'm a junior at the college and chair of the Student Advisory Committee of the Institute of Politics. My question relates to what you were saying earlier about the member states being at least part of the problem in what's going on. If you were President Clinton and didn't have to change your mind Monday to Wednesday, what do you think the policy that President Clinton should be pursuing right now is?
Well, I think we have to address that question to someone who's in a position that they could answer it. And I don't think, Alvaro, you would want to be President Clinton today. So perhaps, Ed, would you like to begin it?
Wednesday.
Yeah. You'll be Clinton on Wednesday, yes.
I don't know, maybe I can be Bill Perry. Come in Garazada today. We won't stop you tomorrow. Maybe we will. I don't have any perfect solution if I were president right now. I mean, it's easy to say, it's sort of Monday morning quarterbacking. There were a lot of opportunities over the last 2 years. But as the clock ticks, there are fewer and fewer opportunities. And they're really nothing but bad answers now. I would try to work with others on the Security Council to try to get the arms embargo lifted. There is right now legislation that could easily, if it passes in the next few days, require the president to unilaterally lift the sanctions, which I think would be a very bad thing, would have dangerous implications for places where we want to keep them, places like Iraq, places like Haiti, places like Libya. I do think that the most critical thing, frankly, at this point, is just decide what your policy is, announce it clearly to the American public and to the Congress, and stick to it. The biggest problem is the inconsistency. I mean, I'm not one who says we have no national interests in the former Yugoslavia. That has been said. It was even at one point last spring said by the Secretary of State that we have no national interest in that area. I mean, pretty soon every crisis comes up. None of them do we have any interest in. Perhaps if we get in war with Canada, we might have an interest there. But I do think we do have interest. But I think if we want to really turn around the situation militarily, if we really are saying that ethnic cleansing can't stand, if the aggression and the gains of the aggression should not be written into an agreement, then we have to get our hands dirty, and we have to put troops on the ground, and we can't just do it from the air. We have to join the others and make clear to everyone that the rules of the game have changed. Not that we want to enter on one side or the other in the conflict, not that we want to say one side wears white hats and another side wears black hats, but if you really want to change the nature of the outcome, you have to change the military equation. The negotiations will be dictated by who has troops at what point. It can't be done from the air. It's where you have troops on the ground. So if we decide that, in fact, the kind of solution that is developing militarily is unsatisfactory, it has to be reversed. It's not going to be reversed by our dropping a couple bombs from the air and asking the Europeans to stand there. It will only be changed if we put forces on the ground. I don't think the president is ready for that. Perhaps Haiti is a lot simpler to accomplish, and perhaps is more of a domestic constituency. But it does seem to me at least he should be consistent and honest. I think that would help.
Professor Hoffman, do you want to add to that?
I just agree. I agree completely with this. It seems to me that, for instance, if we take, let's not go back to the beginning of the Clinton administration, but it is really an extraordinary signal to send to the Serbs to say at the same time as one threatens them with pinpricks, that this should not be seen as an indication that the US has stopped being neutral in the conflict. Now, you know, a year and a half ago, this president explained that the US would not support the Vance Owen plan because it was an unfair plan. Now he's telling us he's perfectly neutral. You cannot do things like this. And it seems to me the only point on which I would add to what you say is that the one thing that could be done would be to make it very clear that the protection of safe areas, safe havens, is not just a resolution on paper, and that does not only mean shooting when UN forces are shot at, but that the purpose is to prevent the victims from being murdered and preventing the final settlement from being entirely determined by the military preponderance of the Serbs. This has not been done. It is an extraordinary way to conduct diplomacy.
This gentleman to my left, please.
Good evening, buenas noches. I'm Ignacio Juan Creis from the Mid-Career Program, physician from Barcelona, Catalonia, Europe. I would like to ask, in the new disorder world, in some way, the crisis we are listening, watching, feeling, in some way represents the incapacity of all institutions that we have, In some way, UN, the European, now lastly was European Community, now the European Community, the European Union, or the new administration, no? In some way, how you would redesign, no, these all institutions, because in some way represents might be a lack, an incapacity or schizophrenia of having these institutions which might be are not the institutions we need in the new disorder world. Thank you.
You know, I don't think that's the problem. Compare, wonderful exam question. Just thought of it.
Before one.
Compare the behavior of international organizations, regional organizations, UN, and governments in the Gulf War and in Yugoslavia. In that case, because there was a will and there was a leader, you had a remarkable cooperation between the major powers, the United Nations, NATO, and an organization that is strictly unknown in America, and for good reasons, the West European Union. Not to be confused with the European Union. In this instance, you have an extraordinary game of Alphonse Gaston. You have a chain of command which includes the Secretary General, his representative on the field, the military commander in Yugoslavia, the military commander in Bosnia, NATO, the European Union, and all of that in complete chaos. Why? It's not because suddenly the number of organizations has multiplied over the last 3 years. It's because in one case there was a common purpose and there was an agreement by powers that something absolutely vital was at stake, like oil, and not only oil. And in this case, you have no such recognition. After all, the only people who die there are sort of, you know, faraway people who have been murdering each other for centuries, which is not true. Now, the precedent one creates thereby is something that we should talk about. This is a world which is full of people who are itching for ethnic cleansing. And the next time that happens, we are going to be in a very difficult position to tell them, you know, you shouldn't do that, because they will then tell us, but you've let it happen. But I think the problem has nothing to do with the organizations. It has to do with, I hate to say so, leadership and will,
Alvaro
and a definition of interest.
I'm sorry, Alvaro wants to speak to that as well.
I agree completely. We have in place what is described in the UN Charter as a collective security system which provides for both a global instance and regional instances. The collective security system, and I say this just in passing, no relevance whatever to the previous question, that it presumes that everything is in everyone's interest, that national interest should not be a criterion on which you judge whether you support it or not, because it may be your own national interest the following day. And you want to establish the same standard in all cases, otherwise you get into a lot of trouble. The problem that we have is that there is no clarity just now as to what the owners of this system, that is member states, want to use this collective security for. And they have not clearly, in this completely new era, they have not decided how far it is that they want the collective security system to be used, and if so, whether they are prepared to provide it with the necessary resources, which it does not have. The UN does not have an army, the necessary resources in terms of fighting men or women, logistics, transport, and finance above all. And until that kind of definition is made, and until once decisions are taken, the means are provided, and member states are prepared to stay the course in order to get the job done, then the tool will remain idle or really limp or not properly used.
Ed Luck would like to add a footnote to your provocative question.
Very brief comments, because it's a very provocative question. One, since we've been dumping so much on the Clinton administration, which is so easy to do these days, I think it is worth remembering that the best chances from a U.S. perspective actually occurred during the Bush administration, and they didn't pursue it. And the European community and the individual European states have hardly covered themselves in glory on this. And I think, you know, through the years we were always taught that this was the one area with a sense of common purpose, a sense of unity, the resources, the organization, the legal structure, where it could respond, and here, boom, everyone as quickly as possible looks the other way. And I think it raises a very serious question for the future about the defensibility of small states. If a small state in Europe will not be defended, where will it be defended? Unless it happens to have a lot of oil under its soil. There is a real question about the rush to recognize the various pieces for whatever reason we're given by one Western European country or another. And I think someone needs to ask, as I've asked a number of people from the Bosnian government, who did you think was going to protect you once you went in this direction? I do think there is a question of states having some responsibility for their own defense and some understanding of how these things are going to work out in the future. Because if I were head of some small country someplace, I wouldn't have much confidence in the system of collective security, be it regional or global, at this point in time. I'd be very scared.
Here, please.
Good evening. My name is Melissa Liasos. I'm a member of the Student Advisory Committee here at the Institute and a sophomore at the college. Some, such as Harvard professor Samuel Huntington, have argued that the future of conflicts will be cultural or ethnic, such as the one we see in Yugoslavia. I'd like to ask any of the panelists to what extent you think that's true, and to what extent we will be able to avoid future Yugoslavias, such as in the former Soviet Union.
First of all, I think you misinterpret my dear colleague. He has not talked about ethnic conflict. He has written about conflicts of civilization. Ethnic conflict, I'm afraid, is very much with us, although I have some reservations about the word ethnic. There ain't anything ethnic between the different brands of Slavs who are killing each other. The word ethnic is beginning to mean almost anything. If you are asking about conflict of civilizations, the West versus Confucianism, Islam, and so on, frankly, my answer is that's rubbish. It's rubbish because the history of conflict shows that it's within civilizations that people kill each other most. At this point, civilization certainly colors the values that different states or statesmen have or pretend they have, but they are not the motivating units. I don't see that. Quite apart from the fact that his division of the world into different civilization zones is very quaint. Because, for instance, Latin America is not the West under his definitions. But I just don't see it. I'm afraid that what we are stuck with is something much more parochial than, the grand wars of civilizations. On the other hand, if you argue that the future will be a war of civilizations, it becomes much easier to mobilize the public and to make a plea for a large defense budget.
Anyone else to address that? Otherwise, we will go on to our next question, please.
Hi, my name is David Bosco. I'm a junior in the college. As Mr. Luck has said, it's easy to criticize the Clinton administration, and I always find it a little bit depressing when critics are so willing to criticize and yet so unwilling to offer concrete alternatives. And I'd like to ask about a specific concrete alternative and see whether you think this would help. Given that I think the European powers and the US are unwilling to commit ground forces enough to push back the aggression, would a policy of heavy airstrikes and arming the Bosnians help the Bosnian army take back territory and negotiate a more just settlement?
Ed, I think that was
why don't I start?
primarily
I'm sure others will want to comment as well. First of all, as I suggested earlier, I do think lifting the arms embargo would be a good thing. But it should be done multilaterally. That's the way it was imposed. And unless we've been asleep at the switch with that and many other resolutions, it was something which the U.S. very much supported at the time. But I would be careful about thinking that's a panacea. There is real questions about how are these arms going to get to the parties you want to receive them. There are questions of training, whether the Bosnian army really could then turn the tide might remain to be seen. Whether the Russians, for example, with Maybe this might push them a little bit in their own internal politics, and if it's not a Zhirinovsky type, which I don't think he's got much of a political future himself, but some nationalist impulse may lead them to get into the business that we both did so well for so many years. You arm one side, we'll arm the other, and both of our arms industries would do great. So it's not a simple panacea. I'm not sure that really heavy airstrikes is going to accomplish a great deal. It certainly is going to raise the cost of rebuilding the societies afterwards, which is a strong tradition that we also have. But it does seem to me that leaves out this question of putting American forces on the ground. And we always come to solutions that don't have any Americans in harm's way. And I just don't think anyone's going to get the message that we're serious about it unless we put the forces on the ground. And if we don't put forces on the ground, I don't think we're serious about it. Lifting the arms embargo sounds like a cost-free effort, and dropping bombs from a high altitude sounds like a relatively straightforward thing to do. So I think, you know, again, we're looking for cost-free or low-cost, low-risk options in a very dangerous, very chaotic situation, and I don't think those exist.
Well, this is a decision which would, if taken, would have to be carefully considered by the Security Council. In fact, there's a proposal in that same direction now before the Security Council, which is being discussed informally amongst the members. Or I'm sorry, it was before the Security Council, but they set it aside for the present. The only thing, and this is just that has to be considered, and this I say as an illustration of what I tried to say somewhat delphically in my introductory remarks, is that should the Council take such a decision, I'm sure that the members will want to consider at the same time what to do, or whether they can continue with the delivery of humanitarian assistance, the protection of the delivery of humanitarian assistance, whether the negotiators in Geneva can perhaps take a vacation for a period of time, and whether the peacekeeping operations, such as they are, need continue in the former Yugoslavia. Maybe they should be shelved for the time being, if such a decision is taken.
We'll move to this gentleman.
My name is Javed Sultan. I'm in the unfortunate position of being not only a Muslim, but I sort of identify myself from belonging to a member of the third world. I apologize if my question becomes long, drawn out.
Rather than apologizing, what I would ask you to do is make it very short, and on behalf of all of us here.
Okay, I'll try to make it short. I think the problem that I see is what the other gentleman had indicated, the problem with the institutions that were created after the Second World War, institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, and all the other European communities. All these institutions were created after the Second World War by the victors to propagate, to promote their own political and economic agenda. And the reason why I say that is that there's no question of moral outrage. There was no moral outrage when South Africa invaded Namibia, or South Africa invaded Mozambique. There was moral outrage when Iraq invaded Kuwait. The world is divided in the modest intellectual capacities of the leaders of these countries between black and whites, between Christian and Muslims, between God-fearing and God-hating. And what I see now is that even though you have United Nations giving decisions, it's not really the United Nations, but it's the Security Council and the group of 5 superpower countries who take the decisions on whether to attack or what to do. The General Assembly can vote itself into saying, let's arm the Bosnians and nothing will happen. So I think the question that I have for Mr. Ed Lugg, because I seem to relate most to his opinions here, I'd like to ask this question, that if we are to bring about a new world order based on morality, based on sense of justice, then we must either eliminate these institutions, create new institutions, or give these institutions a character which will resemble the character of the world that we would like to see. And sorry for making it long.
No, that's fine. Thank you. Good.
It's a a question and a perspective that obviously one hears a lot around the UN community these days. Unfortunately, because of this, Somalia, Haiti, some of the other highly publicized problems that the UN has had recently in the security area, the credibility of the Council, even within the UN community, has come very much into question. And many of us thought that for the 50th anniversary next year, that would be a very propitious time to look in a more positive way at strengthening not only the Council but other institutions within the UN system. Now, I'm not sure. The atmosphere seems to have soured a certain amount from what one picks up around the diplomatic community. I think it's going to be a very hard thing to do. But I think if the Council is expanded, I think there's pretty much a consensus that it would not only be Germany and Japan, but there certainly would be several, 3, 4, 5, whatever, states from the developing part of the world. But in terms of your basic analysis, I think there's some things that don't fit that very easily. I don't think that Somalia fits that very easily. It really is hard these days to say what the American national unilateral interests are in Somalia. I think it's a shame we didn't stick to it. I think it's also a shame that we let it go off track. And that in that case, I think both the Secretary General and the U.S. government both unfortunately headed in the same direction towards going after a deed and moving in a military direction at the same time, and there was no one to say no. And it got a little off course. But even then, I think it would have been good to stick to it. But it was a very major U.S. sacrifice. People forget that in monetary terms as well. It was not conducted initially under the normal kind of formula in the UN, and we had very heavy costs in that operation. And it was one that was a pure humanitarian effort. And while there are all these divisions around the world that we're seeing, at the same time, I think there is some sense that there are some common general human interests out there that do matter. That questions like human rights standards are coming to the fore. To think that one might even consider going to war because of issues like genocide or the treatment of the population in Haiti or elsewhere, I think is for me at least, as something of an interventionist, a positive sign. So I don't think it's a one-way street. I think there is movement, and I think within the UN system as well, there is some sense that we have to have a better division of labor, both in decision-making and on participation in these various operations. And there may be some where U.S. airlift, sea lift, intelligence capabilities, logistics, and other things can come to bear, and perhaps people from other countries will carry out much of the mission. I mean, people forget sometimes that the Pakistanis, the Indians, and some African states are continuing to slug it out in Somalia under extraordinary conditions, even though we pulled out. And now the discussion, of course, is what does one do about Rwanda? And once the Belgians pulled out, it was hard to keep the peacekeeping mission going. But now people are recognizing a need to move back in, not because of narrow national interest and not because of race or ethnicity or what part of the world you come from, but simply because it's a basic stain on the human condition to allow these things to continue.
I'd just point out to the gentlemen, it may be some use to you to know that there are 4 predominantly Muslim nations on the Security Council at the moment: Pakistan, Morocco, Oman, and Djibouti. That's not to contradict your observation. I just thought you might want to know about that. This gentleman right here.
Hi, I'm Winston Copeland. I'm going to the science program here. First, I want to tell you, Mr. Locke, I'm sorry to hear that that you think flying over Bosnia is a particularly safe proposition. I had the privilege of flying over Bosnia about 3 months ago, and I want to tell you that I personally believe that the NATO forces that are flying over there are doing a super job. It's our effort not to get shot down, and they're shooting. Mr. DeSoto, what I want to ask you is, what should President Clinton tell the American people that are vital interests to us to convince the American people to send 25,000 plus ground troops to Bosnia?
I'm not a proponent of the United States sending, or anyone else sending, troops to Bosnia or to anyone else. The decision to put up troops is a voluntary and sovereign one on the part of every member state. Under the Charter, under Article 43, there is provision for all states putting up troops and other materiel at the disposal of the United Nations when it conducts operations under Chapter 7. But that is subject to agreements between the Security Council and member states, and no such agreement has ever materialized. And so until that is solved, all contributions are voluntary, and all that is expected of member states is that once their contributions are assessed under the Charter, that they be paid promptly and in full. That's the only thing that is asked of member states. As to arguments for sending troops, ground troops into Bosnia, well, I really have no position on that.
May I say that Mr. Clinton delivered a very eloquent speech about the American interest there. But this was in February, so it's been slightly superseded by an ocean of statements since. But after the massacre in Sarajevo, he gave an interesting Saturday afternoon speech listing all the reasons why what goes on there should be seen as a vital American interest. Incidentally, I don't think that the alternatives are sort of all-out ground war or doing nothing. I don't think that is the situation at all. I think that what many of us have been talking about here, which is a combination of letting the Bosnians arm themselves, or even the threat of letting them arm themselves, and airstrikes which would be a little bit more than pinpricks, might have an effect. We, I think, have a tendency sometimes when we don't want to do something to overestimate our enemies. I'm not sure at all that the Serbs, who after all have already achieved a great deal, will be that willing to risk very, very heavy losses in order to achieve that much more. But of course, if we don't even try, they have no reason to stop trying to get ever more.
Just very briefly, I'm glad you pointed out, I did not mean to denigrate the courage of those flyers who are engaged in this. It is obviously not a risk-free environment for them. But the point was one of political signaling, and the position of the administration has been very consistently that somehow it's a more hands-off approach. Yes, we may lose a few planes, we may lose a few flyers, but we will not become engaged in the same way as having ground troops there. But obviously, those people carrying out these missions are doing it with a considerable sacrifice. I certainly didn't want to demean that. Thank you.
We have time, I'm afraid, for only 2 more questions in order to keep to our schedule. This young lady.
Good evening. My name is Irina von Wiesen. I'm a McCloy Fellow here at the Kennedy School. And I have 2 short questions to the panel, in particular to Mr. Hoffman, with whose assessment I tend to agree very strongly. The first one is, do you think, in retrospect, that it was a mistake not to lift the arms embargo when it was first demanded so by the Bosnian Muslims? And secondly, also in retrospect, do you think that the European Union has shown itself to be completely incapable of finding a common foreign policy? And if so, what does this say for the future of a political union?
Let me start with the second one. The Europeans have been suffering, if you like, from a great divide for the last more than 40 years. From the beginning, from 1950 on, they have been quite successful, remarkably so, at economic integration, and not successful at security and foreign policy cooperation. This is not new. It's too bad that it continues, but I'm afraid it very well might. The different members of the community or union now have occasionally very different interpretations of their interests. And what was very visible in the case of Yugoslavia was a set of very different calculations. Germany and England were at opposite extremes, the French playing Hamlet in between. But ultimately, when pushed, being a little bit closer to the British, as for the Germans, you had this wonderful discrepancy between sentimental support of Croatia and of Bosnia, but constitutional inhibitions on doing anything about it. So I'm afraid this is not going to stop. This is part of this game I was describing earlier. Yes, I think it was. I think it was a mistake to maintain an embargo which primarily serves only one side. And while I agree with what I heard here about the danger of a unilateral lifting of the embargo, if pushed, I would argue that the parallel with some of the other cases that were mentioned doesn't impress me very much. Because in this particular instance, it's an embargo that is imposed on a state that is a victim of aggression, that is trying to fight for its survival. This is not exactly comparable to the situation of Iraq. And there is something in the Charter known as the right of individual and collective self-defense, which one ought to think about. So yes, I think it was, in retrospect, a mistake. I understand perfectly why very well-meaning statesmen were very hesitant, because their reaction was, it will prolong the war. On the other hand, the very fact that one party had its hands tied between its back didn't exactly facilitate the conclusion of a settlement. Because if you look at it from the beginning, each time there seemed to be a possibility of a settlement, not only did each one contain more concessions to the Serbs, but ultimately it was always some brand of Serb or another one that scuttled it. And that's been going on since the beginning.
Regrettably, the last question.
Hi, my name is Carolyn Scher, and I'm the co-director of the Intercollegiate Model United Nations program here at Harvard. My question is, the UN has always been extremely focused on preserving human rights in the world and doing what it can. Well, all this talk about, the embargo, what military intervention we can do, what about, I would like to know what you would feel, what more can we do to help the thousands of women who are suffering physically and emotionally from rape as a systematic method in war in Bosnia?
That perhaps might be something dealt with by specialized agencies, and perhaps, Alvaro, do you have any?
No, there are two things that are being done about that. One is there's a special rapporteur who has been appointed by the Human Rights Commission, but not provided with very many means to carry out his functions. And also the possibility of actually monitoring on the ground is rather complicated by the fact that there's a war raging. The other is that the Security Council, in an innovative move, has created a war crimes tribunal. And on the basis of investigations already conducted and further ones which it can undertake because it has wide powers, everyone who carries out such crimes as you have mentioned is accountable to that tribunal and can be dragged before it. The question is dragging them before it.
If I might just comment, I think perhaps for the long term on the positive side, this is the first conflict I can remember where this issue really has been raised very pointedly. And I don't know in how many others this has been a systematic policy in the sense that it has been in Bosnia-Herzegovina. But I think perhaps people are beginning at least to raise the consciousness level for the future, that these are crimes against humanity, that these are things that we have to take more account of in the future, and obviously in the solutions that one tries to come up with, and the question of what looks like justice, an eventual solution. This is a very, very important factor. So perhaps consciousness is a step forward. It's a lot less than, as Alvaro has suggested, being able to do much about it, but at least it does perhaps raise consequences for the future.
I wish I could share this relative or moderate optimism of my colleagues here. The steps are interesting and important. On the other hand, for the War Crimes Tribunal to be effective, one first has to catch the criminals, alas. And what strikes me most is that while it is very widely recognized that the massive rapes that have been committed constitute crimes against humanity, the fact remains that for 3 years now, the so-called world community has tolerated crimes against humanity, which it had solemnly said it would not tolerate again in 1945.
I fully realize there are a number of questions that remain, so I propose that while we end the formal part of this program, perhaps our three panelists will have a few more moments to speak with you individually before two of them, at least, have to make the last shuttle back to New York this evening. I want to thank all of you for being such an excellent audience, and I'd ask you to join me in thanking our superb panelists. Thank you.